Hi there, my name's Sanjoli from Productive Nutrition in South Australia, and this is the second presentation in a series of how to have successful lambing in dry conditions, and this time we're going to be dealing with some of the practical and social considerations. So one of the first considerations is, do you have the feed or the financial resources? So have you done some planning? Have you got feed on hand? And is it the appropriate feed for the class of sheep that you're feeding? And do you have the financial resources to continue feeding? So they're two pretty important considerations. Also, in terms of, do you have the feed? Do you have access to feed? So if your paddock feed's running down and you're looking at needing fibre, is there hay within a reasonable distance? Because it's pretty expensive to freight. Do you have access to high protein grain, etc.? So that's a pretty important part of the planning. The second thing that I want to talk about in this session and spend a little bit of time on is pregnancy scanning, because it is a very, very important strategy when it's very dry, and particularly if you haven't got a lot of paddock feed and there's financial pressure as well. Grain is not really hugely expensive following the 2016 season, but in some years it is. So pregnancy scanning can be a very important tool in helping you sort out and manage pregnant ewes. So one of the first reasons for preg scanning is to enable you to plan your resources. For those of you who would have seen the first webinar in this series, you would have seen how nutrient requirements significantly ramp up as pregnancy advances, and also the difference, the big difference between the nutrient demand of single-bearing and twin-bearing ewes. So a very important strategy is to scan for multiples. If you're going to bother preg scanning in the first place, then it's crazy to just do wet and dry. If you scan for multiples, then you have far better information about what's going on. If your system enables you to split lambing ewes into twins and singles, that's fine. If it doesn't, then don't panic. It's easy to manage twins and singles together by averaging their nutrient requirements if that fits your system better. The main thing is that you've got a system that you can manage. Okay, so if you end up splitting your ewes into twins and singles, then the most important time to feed them separately is in late pregnancy, because it's in late pregnancy where we really set those lambs up for survival. So that's the critical time. The other thing that's really important about preg scanning for multiples is that it gives you a comparison of how many lambs you're expecting versus how many lambs you actually mark. And that provides you with some feedback as to your nutritional management. So how did you go in keeping up with meeting nutrient demand? The other thing that it enables you to do, if you're expecting a large amount of twins, if you're expecting 140% plus lambs, then it gives you the opportunity to prepare for that, and you know what's coming, particularly in the ongoing dry, or if you've got limited paddock feed at the time that you scan and there really isn't any rain in sight. So it allows you to just be a bit more prepared. The other thing that pregnancy scanning allows you to do is to draft off the dry ewes. Now, of course, at the moment with merino ewes, you don't necessarily have to sell them. That's purely an economic decision that you would make based on whether or not you've got the resources to keep them. If you haven't, then you can sell them. Otherwise, you can run them at a much lower cost in a dry mob and take them through into the next shearing and at least shear them before you sell them. Alternatively, you can list them on Auctions Plus, where at the moment ewes have got extremely good value. So once again, it enables you to make some really good management decisions. and that way you're not ending up feeding dry ewes with very low nutrient requirements, the same diet as you would be for ewes in late pregnancy or lactating ewes. The other thing that pregnancy scanning gives you the opportunity to do when it's dry is to sell down your twin-bearing ewes. Now I can hear some people, taking in a big deep breath and going, oh no, that doesn't sound like the right thing to do. But we have to remember that in most commercial flocks, we don't know the history of our ewes. We don't know if they're twin-bearing ewes every year. They might be a ewe that's been scanned with twins this year, but the previous 3 years they might have only had a single. So it's actually not correct to think that those ewes are necessarily the most fertile ewes in your flock unless you happen to have that history for each ewe. So if that's not the case and you've got limited resources and limited paddock feed into the future, then there's a very good opportunity for you to reduce demand and reduce the pressure on yourself and put those twin bearers on Auctions Plus and concentrate on the single bearing ewes whose nutrient demand is significantly lower. The reason why I've got just a dot point up there about merino versus crossbred sheep, one important aspect of scanning is that if you don't scan merino ewes and you carry them through and they don't have a lamb, the chances are that they'll produce more wool for you, and at the moment that wool's got extremely good value. So you will still get a reasonably good return from those merino ewes. However, if you're carrying crossbred ewes, then that fleece is of much lower value and you're likely to cut much less of it. And so it's far more important in a dry year to scan, identify those ewes and preferably move them on, sell them out. The other consideration too is how much does it cost you to get the ewe to this point? So how much does it cost you to carry that ewe since she had her last lamb? And at what point are you prepared to bail out or to keep going? And if you're looking at a diet for a ewe in late pregnancy on average across a range of diets, then you're looking at a cost of somewhere around 35 cents per head per day. And that's a pretty significant cost to carry all those ewes through if there really isn't a lot of paddock feed and there's not a sign of a good break coming in the pretty near future. So those are just some practical considerations. If we just look at some social considerations now, then we have to remember that, if you haven't got much paddock feed, if the paddocks are pretty bare and you've got ewes out there lambing, it doesn't matter if you've got lots of self-feeders out there and lots of bales of hay, ewes will still tend to walk away from their lambs when the season is really bad. So weigh that up when you're thinking about where you're going to lamb. If you end up having to lamb in containment, it isn't the disaster that a lot of people think it might be. I've ended up having to put large flocks of ewes, spread them around sheep yards, anywhere in the mallee when there's just been no rain and no paddock feed and no alternative. And the ewes that lambed in containment and in a relatively small area actually did really well and marked about 25% more lambs than the ewes that we left out in the paddock. So the most important thing to consider if you do end up lambing in containment is to separate off the maidens, because they are the worst offenders for causing confusion. They tend to think that every lamb that drops is theirs, and they'll cause confusion. So better to put them in a mob on their own so they can just confuse themselves and let the ewes get on with it, and they'll deal with it pretty well. You still will get mismothering and a percentage of mismothering, but nothing like you will see if you're lambing out in bare paddocks. So also, if feed in the paddock is constrained, then don't hesitate to think about bringing in ewes and containing them in late pregnancy. It's much easier to manage the feeding. It saves them the energy of walking around chasing feed in the paddock if there's hardly anything there. So it's a very good strategy, and I'm sure that most of you would have small areas close in handy towards the yards where you can contain the ewes. Feeding methods, it doesn't really matter. It's just about what works for you. I prefer trail feeding simply because the ewes will all come to the trail and you can make sure that everybody's okay. You see everybody moving, whereas if you've got self-feeders in there, you tend not to keep such a close eye on them. Use extremely efficient sorters, so don't worry about the fact that there's dung on the ground and you're feeding grain in that dung. They'll very effectively sort it out, and provided they haven't gone in there with any disease issues, they won't pick up any diseases while they're in there either. If you put ewes on self-feeders in late pregnancy in a confined area, then they've got nothing else to do. So some of them will spend all day just sitting there at the feeder. So the most important thing to consider is that you have at least more than one feeder, regardless of the size of the mob, because the bosses will tend to just guard one feeder. Make sure that you have salt and lime out there if you're feeding grain, and if the hay that's on offer is not legume based, so high in calcium in particular. So make sure you supplement with salt and lime and that you keep it up to them. And lastly, consider the ease and the time it takes for you to do your feeding when you're going to set this whole thing up. But the most important consideration is to get the sheep off paddocks that haven't got any feed in them, and particularly around the break of the season. So if you've got a small amount of green shoots out there in the paddock, then relieve the pressure on them and let them get away, so that, you know, the more leaf area you develop there, the faster that pasture will grow if you take the pressure off it. And that's all for now.